The Men of War series has been ever popular since its inception back in 2009. Okay, I know it was actually just an evolution of another series, but that's not the point. From the original Men of War to Assault Squad and the ever-beloved Assault Squad 2, it was only a matter of time before something came along that put a spanner in the RTS workings. On the 12th of September 2019, Men of War Assault Squad 2 got a huge expansion, Cold War. An interesting foray into the new and untapped time era, or at least that's what it was supposed to be. But something went badly wrong. Because of all this, I think it's time to dive in to the real depths and work out if Men of War Cold War really is the worst RTS ever. Jumping into the game, the differences aren't immediately apparent. It has your usual single and multiplayer game modes, furthermore boasting a co-op campaign against AI. This is going to be the next evolution in the series, right? Well, heading into the single player gives a very different story. Gone are the days of cheesy but charming cutscenes or well-designed maps. Instead, the cracks really start to show, almost feeling like a rushed version of whatever came before. Maps are basic, not too varied either. The first red flag, pardon the pun, is the lack of variety in factions. There's only two, USA and Soviet Union. Okay, look. I get it makes sense. We're basing a game on Cold War. Of course, there's only going to be two factions, but it's kind of the first sign that actually the Cold War time period might not lend itself to the full price content that people are expecting. Back in the original Assault Squad 2, we had the classic World War II setting, and it was brilliant. Men of War had made its name in the Second Great War, so the devs clearly knew what they were doing. There was also such a variety in weaponry, tanks, and of course, factions. If you want heavy armor and solid defense, play as Germany. Want great standard infantry and fast-pushing all-rounders? The US and the Commonwealth are at your disposal. What about swathes of infantry and experimental weaponry? Well, Russia and Japan are always happy to help. This expanded further into the arms. In World War II, there was such a variation, from World War I leftovers like the Lee Enfield, all the way to new experimental flame tanks and rocket batteries. The Cold War setting, though, never really had this. Weaponry at the time really started to be streamlined and get more efficient. It was great for war, but not great for variation in a video game. So, off I go into the single player, and I'm greeted with a new kind of mechanic. So I've got these points, and I can choose which units that I want to bring into the battle or what I have in reserve. So that's actually kind of neat. So if I want, I can choose more infantry, but I have to sacrifice armor or vice versa. Oh god, I need to make sure that I remember an ammo truck as well. I don't want to be caught shortchanged there. It adds this whole new element of push and pull and where you spend your points and how this changes between the missions. But loading up the campaign, it starts to become really apparent that this wasn't the same kind of Men of War game that made me fall in love with the series back in the day. It isn't this large dynamic campaign as was advertised. Instead, it's just a few maps where you can play skirmishes with the AI. You know, that side mode that Assault Squad 2 had. Skirmishes where you pick a map and you play against any faction you want, and that's pretty much the whole game mode. And now they've made that into a full single player campaign. It seems kind of lazy. And once again, there's only one other faction to play against and only a few maps. In Assault Squad 2, we had swathes of incredible maps of different variations in sizes and scenery and terrain. And of course, we had all the different factions that we could play against. And the disappointment of Cold War didn't necessarily come with the lack of factions or the lack of love being put into it, but it kind of just came with laziness. But I marched on. The first map was actually pretty fun, and the second was kind of hard. Heading into the third gave a little bit of variation, and it gave me a good indication of the future that I would have with this title. In other words, there wouldn't be much of it. Playing for about 2 hours got me past the halfway mark of the game, and I can imagine on easier difficulties it's even quicker to beat. There are a lot of initial negatives, but what about some good things? Well, the sound design is actually great. It's better than most other Men of War games. The crack of these automatic weapons bouncing off the ruined walls of a town that once was. It felt very Men of War, and for a second put me back in that world that I so much love. The campaign tried to make you feel like you were taking a unit of men through multiple missions with using the same troops. So vehicles would have to be repaired between missions, and if they'd been damaged, you'd have to make sure you were looking after them properly. Your squad can grow and change between said missions. If you decided you need a new setup for the challenge at hand, you can switch out the units that you want to take in. But then another issue comes in. As mentioned, there's no intro or cutscene letting you know what you're about to face, so you need to have actually gone into a mission, failed it, come back out, and then change your units before trying again. Something that would have been really nice would be an in-character mission overview, letting you know the enemy forces and the mission objectives to then plan it out and pick the best units for the best job. I love how they had these pre-mission overviews and objective briefings in the previous games, especially with comically over-the-top stereotypes of each countryman, the upper-class British twit or the American renegade. And you know what's more? AS2 not only had 5 factions, but had a full campaign for each and every single one of those 5 factions. But Cold War hardly even has a fifth of that. I get it, Men of War has never been single player orientated. The campaigns have always been linear missions with a few tasks to do along the way, but not all that fleshed out. But at least in the other games there was a ton of different maps to experience and each level felt complex and different in its own way. But Cold War doesn't even scratch the surface of this. After all this, it is no surprise that my experience wasn't unique. This frustration was felt by so many in the Men of War fanbase. Not only was it a wasted opportunity to experience something new here, you know, a take on Cold War gone hot scenarios, but it was a sign to the fanbase that Men of War as a series was going in the direction of less content for more money. Not only did this retail at $25, but it didn't really offer enough content to justify a $15 game. That's strike one. Upon release, crashes and bugs plagued the title. Men of War hasn't always been the most optimized of games, but Cold War seemed especially janky. Reports of terrible multiplayer performance flooded in time and time again. Unless you had a behemoth of a system, the game almost just said, "No, go away, poor person. You don't deserve to play me." I mean, the game said it, not me, by the way. I wouldn't be that mean. I touched on the campaign just being skirmish missions repurposed, but other issues started to come in. You'd be playing against the AI, of course, but the AI was another level of stupid. Charging light vehicles to be blown up, infantry lying in the middle of open fields letting themselves be mown down by only a few of your own, with more reports of AI stubbornness, where they'd spawn in units, then set a waypoint for those units in the middle of the map and just charge them in there, being minced up over and over again. It was almost laughable. But when it comes to content, single player has to be that leader. Because whilst the game does feature multiplayer, the lack of content within a single player has negative effects to the multiplayer proportion. When a game gets mostly negative reviews on Steam from the single player, it doesn't exactly attract people to the title. So even though it came out in 2019, it's still vastly less popular than Assault Squad 2. I mean, Cold War's all but dead at this point. So what is the real issue? Why is Men of War Assault Squad Cold War so hated? Me and many others absolutely adore the Men of War series. I would actually put AS2 in my top 5 games of all time. But Cold War really missed the mark. Something that's actually not uncommon with the Men of War spin-off titles. We've seen this time and time again with their forays into different time periods. It happened with Vietnam and now Cold War. The lack of content being noted as their biggest downfall. It isn't enough anymore to just reskin a game for different weapons and factions. There needs to be something new, more campaigns that really fit that time period and tell a unique story that we've never seen before. I think the main hitting point is just the fact that it's a missed opportunity. The Cold War is a period that games rarely go into, maybe because it's so recent, or maybe because there truly is a lot of limitations when it comes to adding content. But for Men of War, if anyone was going to do it, it could have been them, and they could have done a fantastic job, but they didn't. A $10 DLC for the original Men of War Assault Squad 2, that's probably what it would have been worth. And that would have been a great selling point as well. Have it as a small expansion that reskins and redoes all the sounds for the base game, but still use Assault Squad 2 as the launcher. That way you'd be able to get a bit more money, another $10, $15 as an expansion, but it wouldn't have to stand alone on its own. It'd be tacked on to Assault Squad 2, keep the player base alive. But it baffles me why they thought that this would be worth a $25 standalone experience, because it isn't even close. but I want to delve further into the depths of the worst RTS games of all time. The unknown, or like in this case, titles that tried to stray from an already established franchise and were hurt because of it. So we've looked at Cold War, but what's next? What would you like me to cover in the next edition of the worst RTS ever?